For those who don't know me very well, my name is Ryan, and fair warning, this topic is quite broad, so we're going to cover a lot of information in a short time. Partially because we're covering a topic in its absolute infancy, and partially because we're setting a really wide platform that can inform both future research and coaching practice. So we're going to look into technique change in elite athletes and well-learned skills. Now, technique change is embedded in talent transfer. Olympic teams across the world have a high number of talent transfer athletes, and there is a global investment to optimise talent transfer. For example, the top two pictures there demonstrate the pathway from gymnastics to aerial skiing. Both these athletes do twisting somersaults, so unsurprisingly the skill transfers across quite well. The technique actually transfers quite well as well. However, the gymnastics technique isn't necessarily optimal for aerial skiing. The judges don't particularly like it, and it increases some injury risk. So even though the gymnast has spent thousands of hours over decades habituating their technique, we have to suddenly change it. Now, talent transfer isn't the only place that you'll find technique change. The second two images below are the high jump event from pre-1968 and post-1968. You can see there's a pretty substantial change in technique, and if you didn't adopt the new technique, the Fosbury flop, you were going to be beaten. So technique change is everywhere, both inside and outside of talent transfer. So the first really important question is, what do we already know? So I did a bit of a literature review to examine what we know about learning in general and what we know about technique change. Typically, learning is considered to be a novice to expert pathway, and therefore a lack of proficiency or the existence of errors is considered to be a lack of learning. You know, a novice can't do what an expert can do because they haven't learned it yet. A novice is making more mistakes than an expert because they haven't learned the full skill yet. However, technique change is clearly an expert to expert pathway. Therefore, a lack of proficiency has nothing to do with a lack of learning. In fact, any errors or mistakes are evidence for learning a technique that we no longer require. It's been suggested that we need to take a different approach when training technique change as opposed to when training learning from scratch. Because the research is in its infancy, there actually isn't a lot of research out there, and what exists is really messy. So we need to find out what we do know and what we don't know, and we need to report it in a way that matters to coaches. Within my research this year, I aim to find all the strategies that have been used to elicit technique change and report on what matters to coaches. So that is whether performance improves and whether learning outcomes are found. Because if performance declines, the technique change isn't worth it. And if the new technique isn't retained over time or doesn't transfer to competition, that is, there aren't any learning outcomes, it is also not very useful. Secondarily, I aim to investigate some of the underlying mechanisms for technique change. The background literature suggested that these might be variability and focus of attention. Variability can be useful because it exposes the athlete to new techniques and helps them discover what works best, and variability is known to be a functional part of learning and performance. We also wanted to investigate focus of attention because an external focus of attention is associated with better performance than an internal focus of attention. However, an internal focus of attention is proposed to regress learning, which might be helpful to break down and rebuild technique. A systematic review is designed to locate and organise existing studies, synthesising their data and reporting all of the evidence so that conclusions can be made about what is known and what isn't known. So naturally, I used a systematic review to investigate technique change. I searched 5 scientific databases for studies with an expert population with a well-learned skill. They could undertake any intervention so long as the intervention affected technique change. After collecting thousands of papers, I started to read them to make sure that they first included expert humans performing motor skills, and that they proposed a change to technique in a stable, enduring way. Of course, this excludes novice learners and animal studies and studies on life skills, for example, but it also excludes studies that investigate things like the effects of coffee, because this is not stable and enduring. It also excludes studies that investigate one-way transfer, because we want to know how we can change technique within a given context, not how technique changes when you do something new. After narrowing it down, only 14 papers remained. In those 14 papers, there were 16 studies. That's because a couple of papers examined multiple case studies. Within those 16 studies, there were 8 different strategies and several different approaches to the underlying mechanisms of variability and focus of attention. In other words, there was a large variety of study designs. All of them reported on technique change because that was an inclusion requirement, but despite its relevance, not all studies reported on learning and performance outcomes. Once I collated all of the interventional strategies and the underlying mechanisms, I wanted to cross-check them to see how the different methodologies affected different outcomes. The first thing to look at is the overarching strategy, or the model used to design the study and the intervention. The most common was the old way, new way model. It was found in 4 out of the 16 studies. Now, the old way, new way model uses a single training session intervention that usually lasts 1 to 4 hours. It starts with a bit of an introduction to the athlete and an analysis for change and what we're trying to achieve. Then the athlete practices around about 10 repetitions of the old technique, developing a feel for it. Then they practice about 10 repetitions of the new technique, identifying the differences between the way they feel. After this, the athlete will do 10 to 20 repetitions, alternating between old and new techniques back to back. The idea here is that the athlete can practice both techniques and get a personal feel for what's different without being told. They have to self-identify. Once they're comfortable recognizing the differences in technique and controlling the differences in technique, they start to phase out the old technique and just practice a new one. The 4 studies that implemented this model had good technique change outcomes, had improved performance, and when they tested for it, had good learning outcomes. However, not all studies tested for it, and 3 of the 4 studies were case studies with only 1 participant. The second most common model was the 5A model. The 5A model is a 5-step model that usually lasts about 10 weeks, initially starting with an analysis for the need to change, then developing a contrast between old and new techniques so the athlete knows what they're doing, and sometimes the 5A model will implement the old way, new way model as step 2. After this, the athlete goes on to train the new skill over several weeks, consolidate it, and pressure test it ready for competition. 3 of our studies reported to use the 5A model, and all of them found positive technique change outcomes. However, even though motivated to improve performance, none of them tested for performance. In most cases, learning was found. However, 1 of the 3 studies tested for and failed to find automaticity. So in other words, the skill wasn't happening automatically and the athlete was still mentally controlling the skill. All of the remaining strategies only had evidence from 2 or less studies. However, 1 of them did stand out. Of the 16 studies, only 2 failed to change technique, and both of them used an environmental modification strategy within their intervention. So environmental modification is when the environment is changed and the athlete is allowed to adapt to that environment, but they're not necessarily given instruction on how to do it. So for example, runners who typically run in shoes were asked to run barefoot, and unsurprisingly, their technique changed to suit the new condition. However, when brought back to the shod running condition, the technique didn't transfer and the athlete was left with the same technique they started with. The other study that used environmental modification was a netball study and aimed to increase the height of shooting trajectory at the netball goal. They modified the netball ring, trained for a few weeks, and then returned the netball ring to original conditions. In this study, technique did change, but the shot actually got flatter, so it changed in the opposite way than was intended. Now, technique is known to be specific to the context that you train in, so it's unsurprising that changing that context has unexpected or unpredictable changes to technique. In both of these studies, there were no change to performance and learning was found. However, of course, the learning was for the technique that didn't transfer appropriately. When looking at underlying mechanisms, the first one we investigated was variability. One of the ways to increase variability within training is to have high technical variability. This is where you train multiple techniques within a given training session. It could be done like the old way, new way model where you train 2 techniques at once, or it could be done via having an infinite number of techniques. For example, if you're trying to increase jump height, jumping with a shallow squat, jumping with a deep squat, and everything in between. Having a fast run up, a slow run up, and everything in between. It is proposed that technical variety allows the athlete to discover what is individually optimal for them, and therefore allows technique to change positively. So 6 studies implemented high technical variability within their study designs, and all of them found good technique change outcomes, improved performance, and 5 of the 6 tested for learning. All of those 5 found learning outcomes. Another way to add variability to training is to add variability to the environment. This could mean training both inside and outside, or training with different pieces of equipment, for example. Of the 4 studies that used high environmental variability, 2 of them implemented the environmental modification strategy discussed on the previous slide. So there were mixed outcomes for technique change, and the other 2 did improve. When tested, performance didn't decline or improve. And when tested, learning was found most of the time. However, it was rarely tested for. Of course, it's also possible to use low variability strategies, where any deviations from the prescribed technique are considered an error and are therefore corrected. So for example, the coach might prescribe the technique or tell the athlete how they want a skill to be done, and each time the athlete deviates from that or accidentally does the old technique, the coach simply corrects it and asks them to do it the right way. Only 2 studies used this strategy, and both of them found technique change outcomes. When they did test, they found performance outcomes, and none of them tested for learning. The background research suggests that low variability training isn't necessarily very good for learning. However, we don't have enough data to prove this within the technique change research. The second possible mechanism for technique change that we wanted to investigate was focus of attention. Focus of attention can be internal, that is, focusing on joint angles and muscle tension, for example, keeping a tight body or bending your arms. 6 studies used an internal focus of attention within their training interventions, and all of them found positive technique change outcomes. 2/3 of them improved performance, and when tested, learning was found. Within the literature, it's pretty well known that an internal focus of attention does hold back learning. However, when tested, learning outcomes were found for these strategies. An external focus of attention is also possible. So an external focus of attention is when the athlete is focused on hitting targets or reaching high, focusing on things that are outside of their body's feelings. Again, both of the studies that implemented the environmental modification strategy used an external focus of attention, and this definitely muddied our findings. So the findings for external strategies were pretty mixed. However, learning outcomes were found in most cases. It's well known within the research that an external focus of attention can improve performance. There was one study that implemented an external focus of attention and combined this with some level of kinesthetic awareness. So for example, the instruction might be, just be aware of what your body's doing and reach as high as you can. This study did find good technique change outcomes, good performance outcomes, and good learning outcomes. To remedy the concept of internal focus of attention regressing learning, but external focus of attention being good for performance, some studies implemented a staged approach to focus of attention, where initially the focus was internal on your body trying to change technique, and once that technique was changed, the focus transitioned to an external focus to improve performance. The studies that did this, unfortunately, didn't actually test for performance. However, technique did always change positively, and there was some evidence for learning. At the end of the day, coaches just want to know what they can do to elicit technique change within their athletes. There's not quite enough evidence for any of the strategies to say with confidence that this is what you must do to achieve technique change. However, training multiple techniques at once does seem to be a promising start. Technical variability is proposed to introduce athletes to new techniques, and it's well known that variability within training is a functional part of learning and performance. One of the ways to do this is with the old way, new way model. However, there's an overall lack of evidence, and there certainly needs to be more research done to prove its effectiveness. Overall, the research is definitely lacking a bit of quality and consistency, and this is partially due to a divided interest that's different between researchers and practitioners, and partially due to the need for better definitions for technique and technique change. As I go on to do future research, I hope to remedy some of these problems. And in the meantime, as a coach, I'd certainly be keeping my eye out for that future research and introducing a high level of technical variability into the training sessions of athletes. It's well known that variability allows athletes to train and explore optimal techniques, ultimately solving problems for themselves and developing stronger, better techniques that last a long time.